Hi. So I'm Stephanie Lenhart. I'm at Boise State University. I'm an academic in social sciences. I spend my time researching the changes that are going on in governance of the power grid. Spend a lot of time thinking about these changes that people have been talking about. The work that I do thinking about reliability and resilience is really driven by this idea that the transition to a more reliable and resilient power grid is going to be more equitable and sustainable and affordable if these engineering and technological decisions are embedded with and thinking about how decision-making processes are done. And so I'm really interested in the organizations and the decision-making processes and the stakeholder interactions that happen. Today, I'm going to talk about kind of two different lines of research that we've done in the West. And I would argue that I'm going to talk about resource adequacy in the West, and I'm going to talk about why what we're seeing is the West is a place where there is a lot of innovation happening. There's a lot of efforts that have been done to create systems and structures that allow collective learning to happen. And that's propelled forward change that has been different, and it is allowing a trajectory towards adaptable and resilient institutions. So that's kind of the focus of what broadly I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start with kind of underscoring, and Brandon talked about this morning. I'm going to put the numbers up. This is what we're seeing in a challenge for the West. In terms of resource adequacy is the process by which you're making sure that you have enough resources to serve load in the long term. So it's different than some of these other resilience challenges that we've talked about that are very short-term, immediate challenges. This is planning long-term resource adequacy. And it's become a real challenge in the West after a really long time, decades of not really having a lot of load growth. There are projections for really significant load increases driven by data centers, electrification, changes that are happening that are driving a need to have more load. At the same time, the system is facing a lot more variability in that load. It's harder to predict, and variability in the resources that are on the system. You have different kinds of technologies. They have intermittency. They have time limitations. The grid operates differently. So at this time, not only are the engineers and the system operators facing uncertainty, the regulators and the planners are facing a tremendous amount of uncertainty as they're thinking about how do we ensure resilience and reliability on the grid. Moving on, I'm going to show, this is kind of similar to the slide that Sarah was showing. If you look at the West, what's interesting and different about it is it doesn't have a regional transmission organization outside of California. So you can see CalISO here, and this is what Sarah Edmonds was pointing out, is also really different because it is a fully integrated regional transmission organization, which 70% of the United States has, but the rest of the United States, or the rest of the Western grid, does not have that. So as the West has looked at regionalizing and sharing resources in markets, as the West has looked at addressing transmission planning and addressing resource adequacy, they have taken a somewhat different approach. And what's happening is the Western Resource Adequacy Program, which was put together by the Western Power Pool, previously the Northwestern Power Pool, and under the leadership of Sarah Edmonds and many others who came together to create this program. What they're doing, it's requiring planning for resources to be coordinated across, if you looked across the entire Western interconnection, it'd be 14 states, 2 provinces, all of which have really different planning processes, policies, goals. And the resource adequacy program that was put together as RAP created a really unique way that doesn't follow how it's done in other regions. Looking at this context, the challenge was it was really hard to invest in shared resources. You could share if you had extra resources across the system, but it was hard to invest in those together. And so the resource adequacy program has brought these entities together. And it's looking at a way to change the resource planning frameworks. It's allowed a lot more coordination and visibility, and it's driven by binding commitments underneath it. It's been an interesting step, and it's a way of thinking about resource adequacy that's a little different than how it's sometimes talked about in other cases. If you have an RTO, and it is the reliability organization, a lot of those discussions have tended to really focus on capacity markets. How do you create the right market incentives to bring resources on? That's all really important. They focus on accreditation. How do you make sure different resources are credited appropriately as participating in the process? But I think it's interesting to think about, this resource planning and resource adequacy process. It flows through in terms of, it's an assessment of whether you have enough. It drives investment and procurement of billions of dollars of resources. And it interfaces between these technical studies that are done either at a regional level or at a utility level, interface with state regulatory integrated resource planning processes. So you have this interaction going back and forth that's important to consider. And the Western Resource Adequacy Program has done a really interesting thing where you have local modeling of your resources, but a shared approach to some of these other activities that's allowing alignment of data, processes, shared kind of ideas about how you're going to do forecasting going forward, which helps bring together this bigger picture of how you look at the region as a whole. This creating this more coordinated and visible system, this wide area view, it's the same challenge that other regions are facing when they're thinking about how do you plan outside your RTO. So for example, the Energy System Integration Group, which is a group of researchers and practitioners and regulators that extends globally, has picked up as they're looking at resource adequacy. One of the things that's really important to be thinking about are your neighboring grids. The neighboring grids and the transmission are a key part to how you think about what your resource adequacy is. And you think about what everyone heard when Texas had the challenges in their grid and there wasn't an ability to transfer back and forth. If you're thinking about how you do resource adequacy in a wide area view, well, now all these people from all over the world are looking at the RAP program as, wow, they've looked at a way to do that. What can we learn from them? So that's one piece of resource adequacy that's interesting, important, and happening here in the West. The other thing I wanted to kind of highlight is in terms of resource adequacy, and I'm sure many of you who are much more technical than I am are familiar with these issues. But in addition to kind of thinking about how you do planning in a different way, there's a lot of concern, and it did come up this morning, that we need to actually be using different measures, metrics, and models as we think about resource adequacy. So the discussion of, in the past, we figured out if we had enough resources by measuring our peak load over long periods of time, assuming if we could meet that peak load and we had enough reserves over that, would set a reserve margin over that, then we would be resource adequate. And you heard earlier today in these discussions, people are worried that's no longer the case, that you can determine what your resource adequacy is. You need a lot of different measures and metrics, and you need to think about tail events and extreme weather events. And when does that cross over from being reliability and being resilience? And how much do we ask people to pay for reliability when you start expanding this over these really large ranges of time, ranges of events? How do you think about those things together? And I wanted to highlight this on the west, or on your right. the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, again, here in the West, is one of the entities that's really leading in innovating and thinking about this. Also a very stakeholder-driven process, as the resource adequacy, the Western Resource Adequacy Program is, and West Tech. If you think about, this is a stakeholder-driven process as well. And they're thinking about how you can use different measures and metrics to really understand, do you need seasonal targets for resource adequacy? Do you need, what other kinds of measures, and how often do you put them into place? So I think this is really important. The figures on the right are from a different project that I've been working on, thinking about how you can incorporate other objectives into model planning and think about equity across regions and where risk differs across different regions as you think about your planning. Lots of people are thinking about these kinds of questions, but it's hard. And the point that I want to make is there's still a really big gap between these measures and metrics. People are starting to use them, and WEC's doing a lot of really interesting, great work, as is the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. But there's still a gap in figuring out how you translate this information into actual decision-making processes. How do you go in and set a planning target? How do you move away from the 1 in 10 disturbance planning target? These are different measures, but what's your target? How do you figure out a different criteria, a different reserve margin? That's going to come as policy decision makers work together and stakeholder processes engage. And so that's an important step for the future. So just in summary, closing, I think resource adequacy is really critical. It's going to have a bigger impact on consumers than the imbalance markets, although those were super important steps that happened in the West. More attention should be made to these, what should be shared activities? Where do we need this alignment? People have talked about that a lot already today. This interfaces with state level planning processes. How do you coordinate those? And there's a lot of jurisdictional questions about that. How you implement these metrics, and how do you maintain responsiveness to stakeholders? So thank you.